Every neighborhood has its characters, the kinds of people who make suburban life feel more like a stage play than a community. Some are harmless eccentrics, some are petty busybodies, and some are full-blown nuisances. But in our HOA-controlled neighborhood, there was one man who managed to be all three at once. His name was Martin, though we came to know him by a far more fitting title, the fake traffic officer. It began innocently enough, or at least it seemed that way. Martin had always been the kind of man who inserted himself into things that weren't his business. If a neighbor painted their shutters a shade too bold, Martin had something to say. If kids rode their bikes too quickly down the street, he'd march outside, arms crossed, as if he were writing mental citations. It was irritating, but nothing anyone took too seriously. He was just another overzealous neighbor, another cog in the HOA machine. But then slowly his habits grew into something stranger. One day, Martin appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac wearing a neon reflective vest. No one knew where he got it, but it became his uniform. He began carrying a small notepad, scribbling in it as cars drove past. At first, neighbors laughed, assuming he was playing some ridiculous role, maybe even poking fun at himself. That laughter didn't last long. The slips of paper started appearing soon after. At first, it was a single sheet taped to a windshield. Improper stop, $50 fine, pay HOA within 10 days. It looked fake, handwritten and messy, but still carried a tone of authority. The next week, 2 more cars had slips, then 5. Then almost every car parked along the street had a brightly colored note tucked under its wiper blade. Neighbors were confused. Some ignored the notes, assuming they were harmless pranks, but others weren't so sure. The HOA had a reputation for pettiness, and Martin was known to be close to certain board members. A few residents, unsure of the rules, actually paid. Martin's charade wasn't just an odd hobby anymore. It was working. His self-proclaimed role grew bolder by the day. He wasn't just leaving notes now. He was whistling at passing cars, waving his arms like a real officer, and trying to direct traffic during morning school runs. He scolded delivery drivers for idling too long. He berated neighbors for parking too close to the curb. Every action was done with the smug assurance of someone convinced he was untouchable. The HOA, predictably, washed their hands of the matter. When confronted, they claimed Martin wasn't affiliated with them, that his actions were independent. Yet they never told him to stop. It was easier for them to let Martin play officer because his antics scared residents into following rules the HOA could never enforce so aggressively on its own. In silence, they allowed him to build his little empire. The absurdity might have gone unnoticed outside our small neighborhood, if not for the way Martin escalated. His notes began to look more professional, printed on official-looking paper, stamped with a logo he must have designed himself. He added citation numbers, violation codes, even deadlines for payment. It was laughable and terrifying all at once. Then, one afternoon, it happened to me. I had parked my car just slightly angled in front of my own home. It wasn't blocking anyone, wasn't in violation of law or HOA rule, but it wasn't perfectly straight. When I returned later, an orange slip flapped beneath my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was a joke, but the wording made my stomach tighten. Illegal parking, $75 fine, due in 10 days. It looked official enough that I understood why people had been paying. I looked down the street, and there he was, Martin, standing tall in his vest, notepad in hand, scribbling like a detective mid-investigation. The smug tilt of his head told me everything. He wasn't pretending. He believed it. I crumpled the paper, but the question lingered. If he had done this to me, how many others had been intimidated into paying? How much money had he collected, slipping it into his own pocket, under the guise of neighborhood law? In that moment, something shifted. The harmless eccentric was gone. This wasn't a neighbor playing dress-up. This was a man who had convinced himself, and maybe others, that he had authority he didn't possess. Martin wasn't just writing fake tickets. He was impersonating an officer. He was building a false system of control, and if no one stopped him, it was only a matter of time before his obsession took him, and all of us, somewhere much darker. That day, as I stared down at the crushed slip of paper in my hand, I realized this wasn't a story that would end with laughter. This was only the beginning. If Chapter 1 of Martin's obsession was comical, Chapter 2 was where the comedy wore off. By then, the neighborhood wasn't just annoyed, it was uneasy. The bright orange slips of paper under windshield wipers had multiplied, his whistle could be heard at all hours, and his self-assigned patrols were no longer occasional. Martin had turned his fantasy into a full-time role, striding through the streets like he owned them. At first, people tried to shrug it off. Neighbors rolled their eyes and whispered about him behind hedges. Children mocked him in games of cops and robbers. And teenagers laughed when he tried to chase them for riding too fast on their skateboards. But behind the laughter was an edge of fear. Because Martin wasn't playing anymore, he was escalating. The vest had been his first step, the notepad had been his second. But now, he added a new layer. A badge. Not a real one, of course, but one ordered from the internet, shiny enough that, at a quick glance, it gave him an air of false authority. He wore it pinned to his chest like a soldier's medal. To anyone who didn't know better, Martin looked official. And that was precisely what made him dangerous. His notes, once scribbled, became carefully printed forms. They bore headers like Neighborhood Traffic Enforcement Department and citation number 221. He printed them in bulk, stacked them in a file, and distributed them with the confidence of a man who thought he was running an actual police department. He even slipped some into neighbors' mailboxes, an action that pushed him from nuisance into criminal territory. It wasn't long before the stories started spreading. A retired couple on the corner whispered about a $100 fine for allegedly parking too close to a fire hydrant that wasn't even there. A teenager claimed Martin had written him up for reckless biking, and then there was the young mother who lived 2 doors down from me who came home shaken after Martin blocked her driveway as she tried to unload groceries, insisting she couldn't double park even for a moment. She said he waved his notepad inches from her face, threatening to report her. That was when fear began replacing laughter. One evening, while walking my dog, I saw something that confirmed my growing suspicion. Martin was outside sorting through a folder, papers spilling across his driveway. As I passed, I glanced down. What I saw made my chest tighten. He wasn't just writing random tickets. He was keeping records. There were sheets with neighbors, names, addresses, license plate numbers, dates, and alleged violations. Dozens of them. He was compiling files like a police officer would, cataloging his version of crimes and offenders. The detail was chilling. This wasn't a hobby anymore. It was a delusion. The HOA, of course, still pretended they were uninvolved. When confronted, they waved it off. They claimed Martin's actions were independent, not sanctioned, not their problem. But the truth was plain. Martin was doing their dirty work. His intimidation made residents comply with rules more strictly, and the board didn't have to lift a finger. As long as they could deny responsibility, Martin was free to run amok, but denial had limits, and Martin was about to cross one. The breaking point came on a bright Saturday morning. Families were outside, kids playing basketball in driveways, neighbors trimming hedges and mowing lawns. A tow truck pulled into the cul-de-sac, rumbling to a stop right in front of my house. The driver climbed down, clipboard in hand, and approached me. He explained he'd been called to remove a vehicle reported as illegally abandoned. He pointed at my car, my perfectly fine, perfectly legal car, parked in front of my house. On the paperwork was a signature. Martin's. The fury that surged through me was matched only by disbelief. This man had forged his role so convincingly that a real tow truck had been dispatched. I stopped the tow before it happened, but the implications rang loud in my mind. Martin wasn't satisfied with leaving fake slips. He wasn't satisfied with scribbling notes and barking at delivery drivers. He was orchestrating real consequences. If he could call a tow truck and almost get my car hauled away, what would he do next? Would he report false crimes to the HOA? Call emergency services under fabricated claims? His reach was extending beyond annoyance into something dangerous. The neighborhood buzzed with anger when word spread. People were no longer whispering. They were planning. Some wanted to confront him directly. Others wanted to band together and pressure the HOA, and a few muttered about involving the police. For months, Martin had held the illusion of power, and now, for the first time, it seemed like the community was ready to shatter it. But Martin didn't sense the shift. Or if he did, he didn't care. In his mind, he wasn't an imposter. He was an officer, a lawman, the protector of order in a neighborhood full of rule breakers. His patrols grew longer, his tickets more aggressive, his threats bolder. And then came the incident that forced the neighborhood's hand. It happened to a delivery driver, a man just doing his job. He pulled up to the Johnsons' house with a package, stepped out for less than a minute, and returned to find Martin whistling furiously, notepads scratching across paper. The driver ignored him, setting the package down and walking back to the van. But Martin wasn't done. He pulled out something new, a boot clamp, a real one. He knelt down, fumbling to attach it to the van's wheel, his hands trembling with excitement. That was the moment someone finally snapped. A neighbor across the street, phone already in hand, dialed 911. The call went out. Sirens were dispatched. And for the first time in his long charade, Martin's fantasy world was about to collide with reality. The real police were on their way. The morning it all came to an end began like any other. The sun was bright, the air was crisp, and the neighborhood seemed at peace. But beneath that calm, tension simmered. Everyone had heard about the tow truck. Everyone had seen the growing stack of fake tickets. And now, everyone was waiting for Martin to push just far enough that something or someone would finally stop him. Martin, of course, sensed none of it. Or maybe he did, and it only fed his delusion. That morning, he emerged from his house with more pomp than ever before. His reflective vest was freshly washed, his fake badge polished, and his notepad tucked neatly into a pouch strapped to his belt. But there was something new. Slung across his chest was a cheap two-way radio, the kind kids buy at toy stores, though Martin carried it with the seriousness of a soldier. To him, it wasn't a toy. It was evidence of his department. He began his patrol with swagger. He blew his whistle at a car that rolled through a stop sign. He waved at a cyclist, shouting something about safety regulations. He even stopped at a mailbox cluster, scribbling into his notepad as if cataloging suspicious activity. Neighbors peeked through curtains, shaking their heads. But when a delivery van arrived just before noon, Martin found his stage. The driver, parked in front of the Johnsons' house, stepped out with a medium-sized package and made his way to the porch. Martin descended like a hawk. Whistle blaring, arms flailing, he stormed toward the van, shouting about illegal parking. The driver ignored him, too busy with his route. That only enraged Martin more. And then, in front of a dozen watching eyes, he bent down beside the van and pulled out the boot clamp. The click of metal against the wheel echoed across the cul-de-sac. Neighbors gasped. Phones came up, recording the scene. The driver turned back, startled. But before he could react, Martin was already fumbling with the lock, muttering to himself like a man carrying out official business. That was the moment. A neighbor placed the call. Not to the HOA, not to a board member, but to 911. The wait felt endless, though in reality it was only minutes. Then came the sound everyone had been waiting for. Sirens. The wail cut through the air, growing louder, until two police cruisers turned the corner, lights flashing, engines rumbling. They pulled up directly in front of Martin, boxing him in like prey. The cul-de-sac fell silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Martin froze, the boot clamp still in his hands. His eyes flicked from the van to the cruisers, to the officers, now stepping out in full uniform. For the first time in months, his authority was challenged by something real. The officers approached with calm precision. Their presence was commanding but not aggressive, their voices steady as they asked him to set the clamp down. Martin hesitated. For a split second, it seemed he might refuse. His whole fantasy balanced on this moment, his chance to prove, if only to himself, that he was more than just a man in a vest. But reality has a way of breaking even the strongest illusions. Slowly, Martin lowered the clamp to the ground. The questioning began. The officers asked about his badge, his vest, his notepad. Martin stammered, fumbling for words. He claimed he was a neighborhood traffic enforcer, that the HOA had given him authority, that he was only protecting order. He even gestured toward his notepad, offering it like evidence of his legitimacy. The officers flipped through the pages, their brows furrowing. Dozens of names, license plate numbers, and violations filled the notebook. There were addresses, dates, even detailed notes about people's daily routines. The more they read, the worse it looked. One officer retrieved the folder Martin kept under his arm. Inside were neatly organized files, each dedicated to a different household. It was a catalog of the entire neighborhood, tracked and monitored without consent. To the police, it wasn't quirky. It was a violation of privacy, bordering on obsession. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering, recording, watching as Martin's world unraveled. For months, he had ruled through intimidation and illusion. Now, stripped of the illusion, he was just a man in a vest holding a toy badge. The officers explained the situation clearly. Impersonating an officer was a crime. Issuing false citations was fraud. Harassing delivery drivers and attempting to immobilize a vehicle crossed into dangerous territory. Martin's face drained of color as the words washed over him. His authority, his identity, his self-made empire. All of it collapsed in the presence of real power. The officers didn't yell. They didn't argue. They simply placed Martin in handcuffs, guided him toward the cruiser, and opened the back door. As he was led away, his eyes darted toward the crowd. The same neighbors he had ticketed, bullied, and recorded now watched him with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Someone clapped, then another. Soon a ripple of applause spread across the cul-de-sac. Laughter followed, cheers rising like a wave. For months, Martin had played officer, judge, and executioner. Now, in the most public way possible, he was exposed as nothing more than a fraud. The HOA scrambled in the aftermath. They denied involvement, of course, insisting Martin had never been sanctioned, that they had nothing to do with his actions. But their silence in the months prior was undeniable. They had let him flourish because it suited them, and now they too bore the sting of humiliation. Still, the day belonged to Martin's downfall. His patrols ended with flashing lights. His authority erased by the very people he tried to imitate. And as the cruisers rolled away, carrying him toward the station, one thought echoed through the neighborhood. For all his tickets, for all his warnings, for all his self-proclaimed power, there was only one violation that ever truly mattered. The one the real police handed to him, and with that, the neighborhood finally exhaled. The fake traffic officer was gone. Peace had returned, and the only sirens we heard that day were the ones that ended his reign forever.